The moving truck was already gone. Dorothy Callahan stood at the end of the driveway and watched the empty street where it had been. November air pressed against her thin cardigan like a hand pushing her backward. The taillights had disappeared around the corner, maybe 3 minutes ago, maybe 5. She had not counted. She had been too busy trying to understand what she was seeing. The truck had been there when she left for her walk. She had noticed it idling at the curb but thought nothing of it. Miriam was always rearranging something, always moving furniture from one room to another, the way restless people rearrange things when they cannot rearrange the thoughts that actually trouble them. Dorothy had walked past the truck, nodded at the two men sitting in the cab, and continued down Sycamore Street, the way she did every afternoon at 3 o'clock. She had been gone 90 minutes. The truck took everything in 90 minutes. Dorothy climbed the 3 porch steps slowly. Her hip had been speaking to her all week in that language it had developed over the past decade, a low, persistent complaint that she had learned to translate as a warning rather than a reason to stop. She reached the front door and tried the handle. Locked. She tried it again, pressing down harder, twisting with both hands. The mechanism did not give. She stood with her palm flat against the wood and felt the particular coldness of a surface that was no longer willing to recognize her. She knocked. 3 times. The kind of knock that is still polite, still hoping to be wrong about what it already knows. No answer. Through the narrow window beside the door, she could see into the entryway. The coat rack was still there. Her blue winter coat hung from the second hook, the one she had always used. Her medications were on the small table beneath the mirror, her reading glasses in their case. The photograph of Frank that she kept in her room, the one taken the summer before he got sick. His face turned towards some light. She could no longer identify his expression, containing something she had spent 8 years trying to hold on to. All of it visible, all of it on the other side of a door that would not open. She knocked again, louder this time. The sound traveled into the house and came back to her, changed, flattened by the walls and the carpets and the accumulated silence of a space that had decided it was finished with her. Inside, a light went off. The kitchen, she thought. Then a moment later, the living room. Then the lamp at the top of the stairs that Miriam always left on until 9 in the evening, because she claimed the dark made the house feel different. One by one, the lights disappeared. Dorothy stood on the porch in the growing dark and understood. Her daughter was home. Her daughter was standing somewhere in that house right now, in the dark, waiting for the sound of footsteps walking away from the door. Waiting for the particular silence that meant the problem had removed itself from the porch. Dorothy had been a problem she could no longer afford to keep. She did not pound on the door. She did not press her face against the glass and call her daughter's name. Some part of her, the part that had survived Frank's death and the long silence of widowhood, and 2 years of being looked through instead of looked at, that part understood that there was nothing useful to be said through a locked door in the dark. Some conversations could not be forced open from the outside. She stood there for perhaps 2 more minutes. Long enough to be certain, long enough to let herself feel the full weight of what was happening, because she had learned over 76 years that the things you refuse to feel in the moment always find you later at worse times. Then she turned and walked down the porch steps. The street was quiet in the way November streets get quiet, that particular emptiness that has nothing to do with the absence of sound and everything to do with the presence of cold. Windows glowed amber and blue up and down the block. Families pulling chairs close to tables. Television sending light through curtain gaps. The ordinary machinery of people belonging somewhere. Dorothy had lived on Sycamore Street for 2 years. She had moved here in the spring of 2022, after a winter she did not like to think about too carefully, a winter of rattling around the house on Clement Avenue, where she and Frank had raised Miriam and lived 31 years, and built something that she had not understood was irreplaceable until it was already gone. After Frank died, she had stayed there alone for 2 years because leaving felt like a second death, and then she had stayed another year because she did not know where to go, and then Miriam had called and said the words that sounded like an offer, but carried the weight of something more complicated. "Mom, you should come stay with us. You shouldn't be alone." Dorothy had hesitated. She was honest about that now. Some part of her had known better. Some long-trained instinct built from 34 years of reading rooms and reading faces, and understanding the gap between what people said and what they meant. That instinct had spoken up clearly from somewhere behind her sternum. But loneliness is its own kind of weather. It gets inside things. It changes the temperature of every room you sit in and every hour you move through. After 3 years alone in a house full of Frank's particular absence, Dorothy had packed 4 boxes and driven her Buick to Sycamore Street and told herself that this was practical, that this was what families did. The first year was not terrible. They existed in parallel, she and Miriam moving through the same rooms, on different tracks, occasionally intersecting over coffee or the evening news, occasionally almost talking. Dorothy cooked on Sundays. Miriam thanked her with the efficiency of someone completing a task. It was not warmth, but it was not cruelty either. It was the careful, neutral space that people maintain when they have agreed without speaking to keep something small and manageable between them. Then the second year started, and the space began to change. It started with small things. The way Miriam would pause in a doorway when Dorothy was cooking, not quite entering, not quite leaving, hovering in that threshold with an expression Dorothy had learned to translate as calculation. The comments that arrived dressed as concern. Mom, you left the stove on again. Mom, do you remember where you put your glasses? Mom, I've been reading about these communities for people your age. They have activities, they have nurses on call. You'd have people around your own age. Dorothy had tried to make herself smaller. She stopped cooking elaborate meals and started preparing simple things that did not require the full use of the kitchen. She stopped moving things or rearranging shelves or doing the 100 small domestic adjustments that had always been her way of feeling at home in a space. She stopped offering opinions that had not been requested. She became, by careful and deliberate effort, quieter and easier and less present. It was not enough. The sighs grew longer. The pauses before answering her questions became a beat, then 2 beats, then the elaborate pause of someone deciding whether to engage at all. The conversations about assisted living moved from occasional to weekly. Her daughter would sit across the table from her with that particular expression, the one that managed to combine genuine worry with genuine irritation, and say things like, "We just want what is best for you and you deserve professional care, and this is not sustainable." Sustainable. That was the word Miriam used. Like her mother was a resource being depleted. Dorothy knew what was actually happening. She was not confused. She was not losing her memory or her mind or her ability to function. She was grieving still, the particular long grief of losing someone who had been the organizing principle of your daily existence for 4 decades, and she was lonely in the specific way that loneliness cuts when it lives inside a house where there are other people, because that kind of loneliness has no honest name and no socially acceptable remedy. She was also, if she was honest with herself, not easy to live with. She asked questions. She had opinions. She remembered things differently than Miriam remembered them and was not always willing to pretend otherwise. She took up space in ways that could not be reduced to a single guest room and a promise to stay out of the way. Her daughter had looked at the situation and decided the math did not work. And so, the moving truck had come at 3 o'clock in the afternoon while Dorothy was walking. The 2 men had carried her life out of the house in boxes and loaded it into a truck and driven it somewhere she did not know. Her teaching awards from 34 years at Hargrove Elementary, the quilt Frank's mother had made, the box of letters she and Frank had written during his first year working the oil fields in Wyoming before they were married, the letters she had kept in a shoebox under the bed in every house she had ever lived in, because they were the evidence of a time when she had been known completely by another person and had known him completely in return. All of it gone. She had $95 in her purse. She had her driver's license and her social security card and a photograph of Frank that she had placed in her wallet that morning because some animal instinct she could not explain had told her to keep it close. She also had her coat, the blue one on the hook inside the locked door. She did not have that. Dorothy walked. She did not have a destination in mind. Her feet carried her down Sycamore and left onto Meridian and then south toward the part of town where the shops stayed open late and the streets held a little more light. She walked because stopping felt worse than moving. She walked because some old reflex in her body remembered that motion was a form of survival, that keeping yourself moving was how you got from the moment you were in to a different moment, one that might be slightly better or at least different. She had been a teacher for 34 years. The way people say that sentence often carries a kind of softness, a suggestion of chalk dust and apple drawings, and the uncomplicated satisfaction of helping young minds grow. That was not what 34 years at Hargrove Elementary looked like. Hargrove sat in the oldest part of the city, in a neighborhood that had been steadily losing its grocery stores and its working streetlights, in its sense of itself since before Dorothy arrived in 1974 as a 22-year-old with a teaching certificate and the particular confidence of someone who has not yet been educated by experience. She stayed. That was the thing people who knew her always mentioned first. She stayed. Other teachers came for a year or two, sometimes 3, and then moved to districts where the parking lots were paved and the parents came to conferences and the supply closets were actually stocked. Dorothy stayed because the kids needed her and because she had discovered somewhere in that first difficult year that she was genuinely good at this. Good at the specific demanding work of reaching children who had learned to expect very little from adults. And once she understood she was good at it, she could not make herself stop. 34 years. 4 principals. More students than she could count. Kids who came to her classroom hungry, and kids who came high, and kids who came wearing the particular blank expression of someone who has already made their peace with being written off. She had not saved all of them. She was clear-eyed about that. She had failed some of them in ways she still carried. But she had refused to give up first. That was the thing she had been able to give them consistently, the demonstration that an adult could choose not to give up on them. Frank used to say she had iron in her spine disguised as bone. She thought about Frank now as she walked. She let herself think about him because this was the kind of night when pretending not to think about him would cost more than it saved. She thought about the way he had sat across the kitchen table from her in the early years of their marriage and listened to her talk about her students with the complete attention of someone who understood that what she was saying mattered not because the individual stories were extraordinary, but because they were hers and therefore worth his full engagement. She thought about the way he had held her hand in the hospital waiting room when Miriam was born, not squeezing, just holding like he was an anchor she could measure her own steadiness against. She thought about the last 2 years of his life, the careful navigation of a body that was failing, the negotiations with pain and with dignity that he had handled with a quiet grace that still struck her as remarkable. He had not made his dying into a burden. He had managed it the way he managed everything, with the fundamental decency of someone who considered how his choices affected the people around him. She missed him every day. Some days it was a low and manageable ache. Other days it was the whole weight of the sky sitting on her sternum. Tonight it was something in between, a specific sharpness behind the ribs that came from knowing she had nowhere to go. Frank would tell her to fight. He had always believed in fighting, even when the odds were impossible, even when everyone else had reached for reasonable alternatives. He believed that surrender was a choice and not a circumstance, and that the distance between where you were and where you needed to be was usually bridgeable if you were willing to keep your feet moving. Dorothy kept her feet moving. Murphy's appeared out of the dark like something her memory had conjured. She had passed it before on errands, a diner that had been serving the same neighborhood since before she was born, the kind of place that survived, not because it was good exactly, but because it was always there and always open, always ready to be whatever the moment required of a diner. Coffee and fluorescent light and the smell of grease from a grill that had probably not been fully cold in 40 years. She pushed through the door. The warmth came first, the thick, settled warmth of an interior that had been heated by cooking and bodies all day. Then the smell of coffee and bacon fat and dish soap, and underneath it all, something slightly sweet that she could not identify, the accumulated ghost of every meal ever served in the booths along the far wall. A few customers. Truck drivers, mostly men with the particular weathered quality that came from spending most of their lives at the intersection of road and sky. They sat in their booths with the self-contained ease of people accustomed to existing in temporary spaces, accustomed to belonging nowhere in particular, and therefore everywhere. Dorothy found the last booth. She slid onto the vinyl seat and set her purse beside her. She could feel her hands shaking and could not make them stop. She pressed them flat against the table and breathed. A waitress appeared. Mid-50s hair pulled back, the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things years ago and had settled into something more useful. Watchful without being intrusive. Her name tag said Nadine. "Just coffee, please." Dorothy heard how small her voice came out. Black. Nadine looked at her for a moment with the specific attention of someone who has spent years learning to read the people who sit down at her tables. She looked at the thin cardigan and the shaking hands and the expression that Dorothy knew was on her face because she could feel it, that particular expression of someone who is maintaining form after the contents have been knocked loose. Nadine nodded once and walked away. She came back with coffee and a plate that Dorothy had not ordered. Biscuits, two of them golden and still holding heat. Set them down without ceremony. On the house, her voice was quiet. "You look like you could use something." Dorothy opened her mouth to decline. 30 seconds passed. She picked up a biscuit. She ate slowly, tasting butter and warmth, and something that sat somewhere in the same neighborhood as kindness. The first genuine kindness she realized that anyone had extended to her without calculation and longer than she wanted to count. She counted her money. $95. She had done this twice already at the bus stop, and in the cab of the taxi she had briefly considered and then sent away when she realized she did not have a destination to give the driver. She smoothed each bill against the table. 420s, 110, 15. She knew the numbers by heart already, but she smoothed them anyway because the repetition was something to do with her hands, something to anchor her to the present moment rather than the locked door she kept replaying behind her eyes. This was everything. Her Social Security check would not arrive for 11 more days. The $95 was not a cushion, it was a floor, and below the floor there was nothing, no net, no secondary option, no person she could call and ask to come get her. She thought about this carefully and without the flinching that panic would have required. She had spent 34 years teaching children who live below the floor. She understood destitution not as an abstraction, but as a practical condition with specific logistics and specific demands. You could not think about it from a distance. You had to think about it directly, practically 1 hour at a time. A motel room would cost $40. Maybe more in this part of town. That would leave $55 for food, which would last, if she was careful, perhaps 3 days. And then on the fourth day, the $95 would be zero, and she would be a 76-year-old woman without shelter or resources in a city that had very little interest in the problem. She did not let herself think past the fourth day. The fourth day was too far. Tonight was what existed. Tonight and the $95 in the coffee cooling in her hands. That was when she reached for the newspaper. Someone had left it in the booth. The back half of the local paper folded open to the classified section, the kind of newspaper pages that most people flip past without reading the columns of small print that carried the machinery of a county conducting its ordinary business. Estate notices, legal announcements, agricultural equipment, foreclosure listings. Dorothy picked it up because she was a reader by nature and by profession. Because her eyes needed something to rest on other than the table in front of her, because 34 years of teaching had trained her to engage with text as a reflex, the way a carpenter's hands drift toward wood even when there is no work to be done. She read the columns without purpose. Her finger moved along the lines. Then she found it. Near the bottom of the page, in type smaller than most of the surrounding announcements, almost crowded out by a notice about unclaimed storage units and a listing for farm equipment in the next county. County property auction. November 15th, 9 a.m., Courthouse Annex, Main Street. Among the properties offered, 1247 Copper Ridge Road. Former private clubhouse. Abandoned approximately 15 years. Structural concerns noted. Sold as is, no warranties, no inspections. Property carries significant history and community reputation. Minimum bid $95. Dorothy read it twice. Then she read it a third time. She looked at the money on the table. 420s, 110, 15. $95. She looked back at the listing. Minimum bid $95. The coincidence was too precise to feel like coincidence. It felt like something else. It felt like the universe placing a test on the table in front of her and waiting to see whether she still had what it took to pick it up. She had a pen in her purse. She used it to circle the listing. Her handwriting trembled slightly on the newsprint, but remained legible. She folded the paper and put it in her purse beside the photograph of Frank. She did not know what 1247 Copper Ridge Road was. She did not know what kind of clubhouse or what kind of history or what structural concerns meant in practical terms for a building she might actually have to live in. She did not know whether the water worked or the roof held or what condition the floors were in or whether the electricity had been disconnected for 15 years. She knew $95. She knew she needed a door that would open. Nadine came by again an hour later. The diner was emptying out. The truck drivers had paid and gone. A couple near the window had finished their coffee and were pulling on their coats. The manager, a young man with the expression of someone running calculations he did not quite trust, appeared briefly from the back room and looked at Dorothy with the evaluating gaze of a business owner assessing a customer who had been occupying a booth for 2 hours on a single coffee order. Nadine intercepted him. Dorothy did not hear what was said. But the manager looked at Dorothy once and then retreated. She would not be asked to leave. When the closed sign flipped in the window, Nadine came to the booth with a final cup of coffee and sat down across from her. She set something on the table between them. A folded bill, bus fare. Her voice was matter-of-fact, not soft, exactly, not performing sympathy, just direct, in case you need to get somewhere. Dorothy looked at the money. She thought about dignity and what it actually cost when measured against necessity. She thought about all the times she had put lunch money on desks without making it into a transaction, all the times she had addressed a practical need by simply addressing it without ceremony or expectation. She picked up the bill. Why, she asked. The question was real. She was not asking for reassurance. She genuinely wanted to understand. Nadine's face shifted just slightly, the controlled expression opening for a moment onto something more honest. Because somebody did it for me once, when I was out of options and too proud to ask and too scared to know what came next. She paused. The world is not as finished with you as tonight makes it feel. She stood and walked to the door, paused with her hand on the lock. There is a women's shelter 4 blocks west. They take women your age, no questions asked. She unlocked the door and held it open. Cold air came in. Good luck tomorrow, Dorothy. Dorothy sat in the empty diner for a while after Nadine was gone. Then she gathered her purse, folded the newspaper section carefully, and stepped out into the night. She did not go to the shelter. She found the bus station instead. 3 blocks east, a low building with fluorescent lights that never went dark and hard plastic benches, and the particular suspended quality of a place designed for people in transit between places, people who were in between things. She found a seat near the far wall and sat down and put her purse in her lap. She did not sleep. She had too much to think about for sleep. She thought about the listing on Copper Ridge Road and tried to reason through it honestly. A minimum bid of $95 meant something. It meant the county had looked at this property and determined that its value in the open market was low enough to require incentivization. Structural concerns meant damage, possibly serious damage, possibly damage of the kind that no longer met basic codes for occupancy. Significant history and community reputation was the kind of language you used in legal documents when the actual language would be impolite. She thought about what kind of clubhouse got abandoned for 15 years. What kind of history required that particular framing? What kind of reputation made the county cautious about even the description? She thought about what it meant to buy a building as is with no warranties and no inspections. About what it meant to have no alternative. She thought about Frank. About what he would say if he could see her on this plastic bench at 2 in the morning with $95 and a circled newspaper listing and her coat left on a hook in a house that had locked her out. He would tell her to go to the auction. He would tell her that $95 for a building, any building, was better than $95 for nothing. He would remind her in the particular way he had of reminding her that never felt like lecturing, that she had iron in her spine, and that other people's assessments of her situation were not more accurate than her own. She looked at the clock on the wall of the bus station. 3:47 a.m., 5 hours until the auction. She spent those 5 hours the way she had spent difficult nights throughout her life, by staying present in them. Not by making the time pass faster, but by being inside it, by letting it be exactly as long and as hard as it actually was, because she had found over 76 years that the nights you try to escape through sleep or distraction or numbness are the ones that come back to collect the debt later. At 8:15, she stood straightened, her cardigan checked her purse. $95. Photograph of Frank. Newspaper listing, folded to the right column. Her license. Her social security card. She walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, the way she used to look at herself before parent conferences that she knew would be difficult. She assessed what she saw without judgment. Tiredness, yes. The particular hollowness that came from a night without sleep, and a loss that had not yet been fully processed. But beneath that still there what Frank had always called her iron. Still there. She walked to the courthouse annex. The room smelled like old paper and institutional indifference. Tall windows let in the November light at an angle that made everything look better than it actually was, the way certain kinds of light do, promising more than the surfaces can deliver. Dorothy arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the back row with her purse held against her side. She watched the room fill. Farmers with the specific physical quality of people whose work is conducted mostly outdoors. Men with calloused hands and eyes trained to assess things quickly and practically, to see past surface condition to underlying value or lack of it. A couple of younger men who might have been developers or investors, or both, carrying the particular confidence of people who understood which end of a transaction they wanted to be on. The auctioneer was thin gray with the worn efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to stop seeing individuals. Just transactions, just numbers, just the revolving door of things changing hands. The auction moved through its early items with the mechanical pace of an engine that had been tuned for exactly this purpose. Farm equipment, a vacant parcel near the highway, a foreclosed commercial building on the east side of town. The room engaged and retreated with practiced calculation, each item drawing out the bidders it was designed to attract and leaving the others still. Then the auctioneer's voice changed slightly. Not much, just enough for Dorothy, who had spent 34 years listening to the way people's voices changed when they were approaching something they were not quite sure how to handle. Next item, 1247 Copper Ridge Road. Former private clubhouse. Abandoned approximately 15 years. Structural concerns are noted in the property listing. Sold as is no warranties, no inspections. He paused, just briefly. This property served as the headquarters of a local motorcycle club from 1968 until 2009. Approximately 200 members were affiliated with this chapter during that period. The room changed. Dorothy felt it before she could identify it, that particular shift in the quality of attention when a group of people receives information that has pre-existing weight. Whispers moved along the rows. The farmers exchanged glances that carried whole conversations. One of the younger investors looked up from his phone and then looked back down at it in the deliberate way of someone deciding to recalculate. Hell's Angels. Someone said it not quite quietly enough. The auctioneer neither confirmed nor denied. He waited for the room to settle and then continued. Minimum bid is $95. Anyone interested in opening? The silence that followed had a particular quality. Not the silence of a room that had not heard the question, but the silence of a room that had heard it and was deciding collectively and quickly that the answer was no. Dorothy looked at the faces around her. She watched the investors finish their calculations and reach their conclusions. She watched the farmers exchange a second set of glances that carried the same information the first ones had. Whatever the reputation of 1247 Copper Ridge Road was in this county, it was known. And what was known was apparently enough to keep everyone's hands down. The room's silence made a kind of sense to her. She had grown up in the same cultural moment as every other person in this room. She had absorbed the same images, the same news stories, the same shorthand that the word meant in American life. She was not naive about what that history contained, but she was also a teacher. And 34 years of teaching had given her a specific and hard-won understanding of the gap between what a reputation claimed and what a human being actually was. She had learned that gap in the faces of children everyone else had written off. She had learned it in the distance between the file that preceded a kid into her classroom and the actual person who walked through the door. A reputation was not a verdict. It was a starting point. She had $95 and a locked door behind her, and 11 days until her next check, and a listing in her purse that matched the exact number in her wallet with a precision that felt like something more than arithmetic. Her voice came out before she finished deciding. $95. The sound cut through the silence of the room with a sharpness that surprised her. Heads turned, eyes found her in the back row. She sat with her spine straight and her purse held in her lap and let them look. 34 years of parent conferences had given her a complete immunity to being looked at by people who expected her to flinch. The auctioneer looked at her, really looked at her. She watched him process what he was seeing. The age, the thin cardigan, the purse held too tightly, the complete absence of any of the markers that usually accompanied a person who belonged at a property auction. "Ma'am," he said it carefully, "are you aware of the property's history?" Dorothy met his eyes without adjusting her expression. "I am. $95." The room held still for a moment. Then the investor near the front lowered the hand he had half raised. Dorothy watched him make the calculation. An old woman in a former Hells Angels clubhouse. Whatever he had been planning for that property, the complication of this was not worth the potential return. He returned to his phone. One by one around the room, the other possibilities closed themselves off. The farmers had already decided. The other investors reached their conclusions in sequence. An elderly woman who had just bid $95 on a property with significant history and community reputation was not a bidder they were going to get into a contest with. Whatever she was doing it alone, and the situation that would result was not one they needed to be adjacent to. Any other bids? The auctioneer scanned the room. Silence. Going once. Silence. Going twice. The gavel came down. Sold. 1,247 Copper Ridge Road. $95. Behind her someone laughed. Not cruelly exactly, but with the involuntary disbelief of someone watching a person walk deliberately into something they cannot see the edges of. Dorothy did not turn around. She was already standing, already moving toward the front of the room where the paperwork waited, already writing her name on forms that would within the next hour make her the legal owner of a building she had never seen. Her hand shook slightly as she signed. She noticed this and did not try to stop it. The shaking did not mean she was uncertain. It meant she was human, and that was fine. The property transfer took the better part of an hour. Forms in triplicate, signatures witnessed by clerks who moved through the process with the automated competence of people who had done this enough times that it had stopped requiring their full attention. A final handshake from an official who looked faintly relieved, the expression of someone who had been carrying a line item on a ledger for a long time and was grateful to transfer it to someone else's column. Then Dorothy was standing on the courthouse steps with a deed in her purse and $75 left in her wallet. The taxi cost $22, a fifth of what remained gone before she had even seen the place. The driver was an older man, quiet in the way of people who had learned that silence was a service worth providing. He followed her directions without comment, turning off the main road onto a county road, and then onto gravel, and then onto something that was technically a road only because it was slightly more deliberate than the surrounding terrain. The building appeared at the end of the track. Dorothy looked at it through the cab window and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. Not fear exactly, not disappointment, something more complex. The recognition of a thing that had once been considerable and was now in the process of becoming something else, not destroyed yet, but in the long middle stage of destruction, which was in some ways the most revealing state. You could see the original structure clearly when it was in this condition. You could see what it had been designed to hold. 2 stories of brick, the color faded from whatever red it had been to something closer to clay. Windows boarded with plywood weathered to gray. A massive garage running along the south side, its rolling door bearing a painted image that even from a distance, even through the cab window and the November light, stopped her breath for a moment. A skull wearing a winged helmet. The paint had been weathered by a decade and a half of sun and rain, but had not been erased. It looked like something that had decided to outlast everything around it. "You sure about this?" The driver said it without judgment, but with the specific weight of a man who had driven enough unusual fares to develop a genuine concern for the people in his back seat. Dorothy paid him. She watched the number on her remaining cash drop to $53. She climbed out of the van and the door closed behind her, and the driver sat with the engine running for a moment, his eyes on her in the rearview mirror. She did not turn back. He drove away slowly. She listened to the sound of his engine until the distance took it, and then she was standing in the overgrown gravel lot in front of a building she owned in the quiet of a November afternoon, with the wind moving through the dead weeds and the painted skull watching her from the garage door. She looked at the building for a long moment. She looked at the boarded windows and the sagging roofline over the eastern corner and the weeds that had pushed up through every crack in the parking area. She looked at the rusted metal of the main door and the faded brick and the way the whole structure listed slightly, as if it had been leaning into the prevailing wind for so long that it had forgotten how to stand fully upright. Then she walked up to the door and pushed it open. The smell came first. Motor oil so old it had become part of the building's chemistry, soaked into the concrete and the wood until it was indistinguishable from the material itself. Old leather, the kind that held the shape of bodies long gone. Smoke not recent, the ghost of decades of smoke embedded in every surface. And beneath all of it, underneath every other layer, the sweet, patient smell of decay, of organic materials in the slow process of returning to simpler forms. She stepped inside. The main room was larger than she had expected. The boarded windows filtered the light into something dim and gray, but sufficient. 40 feet across, she estimated. Maybe more. Concrete floor cracked in a dozen places, but solid underfoot, not the hollow sound of something undermined. A bar ran the length of the far wall, bottles still on the shelves behind it, most empty, some broken glass catching the light from the gaps in the window boards. A pool table in one corner, its surface sunk under the weight of years of accumulated dust. A small raised platform against the wall that had once been a stage, or at least a performance space. But it was the walls that stopped her. Names everywhere, carved into the wood paneling with knives or keys or whatever sharp objects had been at hand. Written in permanent marker, black and red and blue, in handwriting styles ranging from careful to frantic. Names and dates and brief declarations that she could not read all of from where she stood, but could feel the accumulated weight of. Rider 1975. Biscuit gone but not forgotten. Brothers forever, no exceptions. For those who ride in the dark, may they find the light. We were here. Photographs covered what the names left uncovered. Hundreds of them affixed with thumbtacks, gone orange, all with rust layered sometimes 2 and 3 deep. Men on motorcycles, groups in front of buildings, processions of bikes stretching into distances she could not see the end of, gatherings around tables loaded with food. Funerals unmistakable in their particular solemnity, the long lines of leather and chrome moving through streets that had stopped to watch. In almost every photograph across decades of documentation, the same figure appeared with a consistency that could not be coincidental. An older man, gray-bearded even in the early photographs, with eyes that managed to be kind even across the decades, and the poor quality of old film and the scratches and fading of time. In some photographs, he stood at the center of groups. In others, he was caught at the periphery watching something outside the frame. In one taken what looked like the early 1980s, he stood with a boy of maybe 15 who was trying to look older than he was, one large hand resting on the boy's shoulder with a particular weight of reassurance. Someone had written a name in small, careful script beneath that photograph. Iron. Dorothy stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, letting herself see all of it. The names in the photographs, in the leather vests hanging from hooks near the door, arms empty, still holding the shapes of the bodies that had filled them. The pool table and the stage and the bar with its ghost bottles. These were people, real people who had laughed in this room and argued in this room and found in this room something they could not find anywhere else. Who had built here in this broken brick building at the end of a gravel road, something worth putting their names on walls for. Something worth driving hundreds of miles back to every year to remember. She explored carefully. The upstairs contained smaller rooms, some with the remnants of furniture, all covered in the same layered graffiti of names and dates and declarations. The bathroom held a cracked mirror and a sink that might work if the water was connected. A back storage room contained broken equipment, old tools boxes she did not open yet. Then she found the basement door. Heavy oak, reinforced with metal strips, bolted across its face at top and bottom. A padlock industrial grade held the latch. Chain had been wrapped through the handle and around the reinforcing strips and back through itself. Thick links gone orange with rust wound, with the deliberateness of someone who had not just wanted to lock this door, but had wanted to make certain that opening it would require a real decision, a genuine commitment more than casual curiosity. Whatever was on the other side had been sealed away. Not hidden exactly because the door was visible to anyone who walked through the building, but protected, made inaccessible to anyone who had not decided that knowing was worth the effort of finding out. Dorothy looked at the padlock and the chain for a long time. Her body reported its various complaints from the concrete floors in the November cold and the night without sleep. Her hips spoke. Her lower back added its opinion. She put her hand on the chain and felt the weight of it. Cold metal. 40 years maybe of sitting in the dark. Whatever was behind this door had outlasted the people who put it there. had waited through 15 years of abandonment, had waited for whoever was willing to decide that knowing was worth it. Tomorrow, she thought. She would deal with tomorrow's mysteries tomorrow. Tonight, she needed to survive, which was a more immediate and practical problem. She found candles behind the bar. Old ones partly used in glass holders. She lit one and carried it to the corner she had identified as the cleanest available space away from the broken glass and the worst of the structural debris. She had nothing to sleep on. No blanket, no pillow. She had her cardigan and her coat. She had the candle. She had 6 crackers she had bought at a gas station on the walk from the courthouse with the last of her practical spending money. She ate the crackers one at a time. She sat with her back against the wall and the candle in front of her and let herself look at the room she now owned. At the names on the walls and the photographs and the empty vests hanging by the door. She thought about what it meant to be 76 years old and starting over. She thought about the shape of the rest of her life and how completely it had changed in the past 36 hours. She thought about Frank and what he would say about this specific situation, a thought that arrived with the particular bittersweet quality that came from knowing him so completely that she could still access his voice even 8 years after it had gone quiet. He would tell her she was tougher than the situation. He would tell her that the gap between where she was and where she needed to be was smaller than it looked. He would tell her that the iron in her spine had not gone anywhere, and that people who underestimated her were making a mistake they would have occasion to recognize. The candle burned. Wax pooled at its base. The names on the walls caught the light and threw it back, change making the shadows move, as if the room had its own slow breathing. Dorothy Callahan had been thrown away at 76. She had bought herself a door that opened for $95 and the willingness to raise her hand when no one else would. She closed her eyes. She did not know that at 2 in the morning the night was about to introduce itself properly. Did not know that the first sound she would hear in her new home, before the birds or the wind or the settling of old wood and cold air, would be the unmistakable sound of motorcycle engines. Multiple of them, getting closer. Did not know that the next chapter of her life was already on its way down Copper Ridge Road. She breathed. The candle held. Outside, the November dark lay over everything, without preference, covering the broken building and the gravel lot and the painted skull on the garage door, with the same patient indifference it covered everything else. In 12 hours, she had lost a home and bought one. What she had bought, she was only beginning to understand. The sound came from far away first. Dorothy had not been sleeping. She had been existing in that particular suspended state that arrives after exhaustion has moved past the point where sleep is possible, a kind of waking stillness, where the body has stopped demanding and the mind runs quiet on whatever fuel remains. She had been in that state for perhaps 2 hours, sitting with her back against the wall, and the candle burned down to a stub in front of her when the sound reached her. She heard it before she understood what it was. A low vibration at the edge of perception, the kind of sound that the body registers before the mind catches up, that communicates itself through the floor and the walls and the soles of the feet before it resolves into anything identifiable. She sat forward, listened. Then it resolved. Engines, multiple engines. The specific deep register of large motorcycles running at road speed, not the thin sound of smaller machines, but the full-throated authority of engines built for distance and in weight. She counted instinctively the way she used to count the seconds between lightning and thunder. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 of them, getting louder with a steadiness that meant they were coming directly here and not passing. Dorothy stood. Her body filed its usual complaints, but she was already moving past them, already crossing the room toward the boarded windows, looking for a gap in the plywood wide enough to see through. She found one near the edge of the window frame, a finger width of space where the board had warped slightly away from the sill. Headlights still distant, moving along the road that led to the property, then turning onto the gravel track. The sound of the engines changed character as the machines slowed the pitch, dropping the rhythm, becoming deliberate rather than traveling. They were pulling into the lot. Dorothy stood in the dark of her new home and considered her options with the same directness she had applied to every practical problem in the past 36 hours. She could move to the back of the building and find a corner and be still, and hope that whoever had arrived would take what they wanted from the property and leave without searching every room. This was the option that common sense recommended. She was alone, elderly, without any means of defense or communication in an isolated building that she had owned for less than 12 hours. The people outside had engines and leather, and the particular authority of people who knew this place better than she did. The other option was to go to the door. She thought about Miriam turning off the lights one by one. She thought about what it felt like to stand on a porch and have the world decide that you did not warrant the dignity of being addressed directly. She thought about 34 years of standing in doorways when it would have been easier to step back. At 76, hiding felt like something she had already done enough of. She walked to the front door. Her hand was steady when she reached for the handle, steadier than she expected it to be. She pulled the door open and stepped out into the cold. The night air came in hard and clean, carrying the smell of exhaust in November, and something else underneath both of those, something that she would later struggle to name, but that she associated afterward with the specific atmosphere of people who had driven a long way for a reason that mattered to them. 5 motorcycles sat in the gravel lot, arranged in a loose semicircle, their engines now silent, the metal ticking softly as it cooled in the cold air. The chrome caught the moonlight in pieces, handlebars and mirrors, and the curved surfaces of fuel tanks, all of it sending back fragmented reflections of a sky that had cleared while she was inside. 5 men stood near the machines, leather vests over heavy jackets. She could not read the patches in the dark, but she could feel the weight of them, that specific gravity that comes from things earned rather than purchased. They were looking at her with the collective expression of people who had expected to find an empty building and had found something else entirely. The man at the front was perhaps 63. His beard was gray and braided, hanging to the middle of his chest. His face carried the weathered quality of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors, not the recreational outdoor quality, but the working kind, the kind that came from years of exposure without vanity. Scars traced his knuckles. His eyes, even in the dark, even at this distance, were not cruel. They were careful. The eyes of someone who had survived long enough to understand the difference between situations that required aggression and situations that required something more patient. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Did not know anyone bought the place." His voice was rough in the way of voices that had spent decades competing with the engine noise. Not hostile. Surprised and working through the implications of the surprise in real time. Dorothy squared her shoulders. The cold was significant, and she had no coat, but she did not let it show in her posture. "As of yesterday morning, I did." The man studied her. The assessment was thorough and not unkind, taking in her age and her cardigan and the particular combination of exhaustion and steadiness that she knew was visible on her face because she had stopped trying to conceal either of them. One of the others stepped forward, younger 30s perhaps, with the kind of physical presence that came from spending a lot of time doing things that required it. His expression was caught between confusion and something harder. "Lady," his voice carried a respect that was working against something else. "No disrespect, but this is sacred ground to us. You do not understand what you bought." Dorothy looked at him. "Then you should have bought it yourself." The silence that followed had a quality she recognized from parent conferences. The moment when someone realizes that the person across from them is not going to be moved by the first application of pressure and has to recalibrate. Another of the men, older with chains hanging from his belt that caught the moonlight, moved slightly forward. His voice was flat and direct. "We have things inside. Personal things. We are taking them tonight." Dorothy shifted her weight and blocked the doorway more completely. Not without asking first. The words came out in the voice she had developed over 34 years for exactly these moments. The voice that was not loud and was not aggressive, but that communicated with complete clarity that the person using it had no intention of moving. The voice that told students and parents and administrators alike that they had miscalculated if they thought this particular woman was going to step aside because they expected her to. The younger man's jaw tightened. His hands moved at his sides. Behind him, the man with the chains had closed another foot of distance. Then the leader raised one hand, a single gesture, unhurried. The kind of movement that had authority built into it from long use, the kind that worked because everyone in the vicinity had learned to read it correctly. Everything stopped. He turned back to Dorothy. Something had shifted in his expression. It was subtle, but she had spent too many years reading faces to miss it. Something that sat in the same neighborhood as recognition. As if he had recalibrated his assessment and arrived at a different conclusion than the one he had started with. He said. His voice had changed its register slightly. We are not here to frighten you. He paused. I can see we did anyway. I apologize for that. He took a breath, the kind that came before words that were difficult to find the shape for. Brothers died in this clubhouse. Good men. We come back every year on this date. It is an anniversary. He stopped. Then more quietly, 20 years ago tonight, we lost our president. Found him in the morning, right at the bar inside. His heart gave out. He had been up all night working on something. We never found out what. Dorothy waited. His name was Iron, the man said. His name was Iron, and everything in this building carries his memory. That is why we come back. He looked at her steadily. Not to take anything, to remember. The cold pressed against her. The gravel was pale in the moonlight. Dorothy looked at the 5 men standing in front of her, at the motorcycles behind them, at the painted skull on the garage door that was visible even now at the edge of the lot's darkness. She looked at them differently than she had 60 seconds ago. Not threats, mourners. Men who had driven through the night to stand in a place where someone they had lost still existed, in the only form the dead can manage, in the evidence of what they had built, in the names they had left on walls. She stepped back from the doorway. You can come in, she said. She watched the surprise move through the group, brief, quickly controlled, but genuine. But you knock first, she added, next time. And you tell me what you are looking for. This is my home. The leader looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. One short, considered movement. He extended his hand. Rex. And that is Garrett, Harmon, Birch, and Dane. Dorothy took his hand. His grip was firm, but careful, adjusted to something that acknowledged her without condescending to it. Dot Callahan. Rex held her hand a moment past the formal duration of a handshake. Then he released it and walked past her into the building. The others followed. They moved through the doorway with a quality she had not expected, something that approached reverence, the particular body language of people entering a space that carries weight for them. Dorothy stood on the threshold and watched them go inside and then followed. The candle stub had gone out while she was at the door. In the dark, Rex produced a flashlight and swept it across the room with the sureness of someone who knew exactly where everything was. The beam moved across the names on the walls, across the photographs, across the bar, and the hanging vests in the stage. The men stood in the room and were quiet for a long time. Garrett, the youngest, stood in front of one of the photographs. His hand came up and then stopped before touching it. Harmon sat down at one of the bolted tables and put both hands flat on the scarred wood and stared at the surface. Birch moved to the bar and stood with his back to the room looking at the bottles. Dane, the one with the chains, found the photograph on the wall that Dorothy had noticed earlier, the one of the gray-bearded man with the boy of 15, and stood in front of it without moving. Rex walked the perimeter of the room slowly, his flashlight moving ahead of him, his face carrying an expression that Dorothy recognized from the funerals of people she had lost. The particular grief of someone standing in the physical evidence of absence. After a while, he came back to where Dorothy stood near the door. I need to tell you something, he said. His voice was quieter than it had been outside, reduced to the register appropriate for the space they were in. Stitch, he started, then corrected himself. Iron. Before he died, he told me once that if anything ever happened to him, we would know where to find what he left for us. He said it the way you say things you do not expect to need to say, like a precaution you are taking without believing it will be necessary. He died 3 days later. He looked at the floor. 20 years we have been coming back here. Every year on this date. 20 years we have looked at every room in this building and we have never found what he was talking about. His expression tightened. And there are men who have their own ideas about what Iron left behind. Men who believe there was money hidden here. Cash from operations decades ago. Real money. Significant amounts. Dorothy thought about the basement door, the chains, the industrial padlock, the careful deliberateness of someone who had wanted whatever was behind it to stay hidden until the right moment. These men, she said, the ones looking for what Iron left. Rex met her eyes. They are not the kind of men who stop looking because the property changes hands. The morning came the way November mornings did, gray and gradual light, arriving without warmth, the sky the color of old pewter. Dorothy woke from a half-sleep she had not intended to enter and found herself stuck against the wall with a dead candle in front of her, and the room changed by daylight into something simultaneously more and less threatening than it had been in the dark. More because she could now see the full extent of what needed to be addressed. The structural damage in the eastern corner. The ceiling stain that indicated a roof that had been losing the argument with water for some time. The state of the plumbing fixtures she could see through the open bathroom door. Less because daylight had a way of reducing things to their actual scale, and the actual scale of this building was a broken space that had once held something real and could hold something real again if someone was willing to do the work. Rex appeared at 9 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag from a bakery in town. He knocked first. 3 precise raps on the metal door. She opened it, and he held out a cup, and she took it, and the warmth moved through her hands immediately. "Peace offering," he said, and figured you had not eaten. She had not. They sat at one of the bolted tables while the November light came through the window gaps and made slow columns in the dusty air. Rex drank his coffee and looked at the walls, and Dorothy led him, understanding that he needed to be in the room before he was ready to be in a conversation. After a while, he began to talk. "The club formed in 1968, he said. He did not look at her while he spoke. He looked at the photographs on the wall with the expression of someone reading from them. Vietnam was taking young men and breaking them and sending them back as something the country did not know how to handle. A lot of brothers came home from that and could not fit back into the shape they were supposed to fit into. Could not do the office in the suburb, and the wife who smiled because she did not understand why he was different now." He paused. Iron understood that. He had been there himself. He knew what it meant to come home carrying things that did not fit in ordinary rooms. So he built a room where those things were allowed to exist. He started the chapter. Gave men who were broken somewhere to be broken without shame, somewhere to work on themselves alongside other people doing the same work. Dorothy thought about her classroom at Hargrove Elementary, about the children who came in carrying things that did not fit in ordinary rooms, about what it meant to create a space where those things were allowed to exist, while the person carrying them figured out what to do next. "We fixed motorcycles," Rex said. "Sure, but mostly we fixed each other." He stood and walked to the fireplace she had not fully registered the night before set into the wall beside the bar. Above it, carved directly into the mantel in letters she could now read in the morning light, were words in Iron's careful script. "For those who ride into the storm, may they find shelter here." Iron carved that himself, Rex said. "First week we had this place. It was his whole philosophy. Nobody gets left behind. Nobody rides alone." He turned back to look at her. 200 men found something here they could not find anywhere else. Over 40 years. Dorothy sat with her coffee and thought about 200 men and 40 years and a building that had been carrying all of that weight alone for 15 years since the last of them left. She told him about herself without planning to. The teaching, Hargrove Elementary, and the 34 years and the particular demands of a school where hope was a deliberate act performed in the face of substantial evidence against it. Frank's death and the long adjustments of widowhood. Miriam and the 2 years that had ended with a locked door and a moving truck. Rex listened the way men listened when they had learned that listening was the more useful skill. Without interrupting, without filling the silences with reassurance. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Sounds like you needed shelter too," he said. Dorothy looked at the carving above the fireplace. "Maybe we are not so different. Your brothers and me. All of us looking for a door that would open." The words settled in the space between them with a weight she had not anticipated. Rex reached into his jacket and produced a paper bag from the bakery. Set it on the table. He had brought enough for 2 people. They ate in a silence that had become comfortable, the easy quiet of people who have said the difficult things and can now exist in the same room without the pressure of performing normalcy. When they finished, he looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided to stop working up to something. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "there is more I need to tell you about what Iron left behind and about who is looking for it." Dorothy waited. Before he died, he was working on something. Spent his last weeks at it, locking himself in this building for days at a time, not telling anyone what he was doing. Said it was important. Said it would matter when the time was right. Rex's expression was careful. "We always assumed it was money. Cash from the early years, when the club did things it should not have done. That was 20 years ago. The club was different then." He paused. "But there are people outside the club who believe that too. People who have never stopped looking. And now that you have bought this property, he met her eyes steadily, they will know someone is here, and they will come. The bikers returned that afternoon, not just Rex, all five of them pulling into the gravel lot with the addition of a truck loaded with lumber and tools and the kind of supplies that communicated intention. They worked without being asked to, without ceremony or negotiation, as if the decision had been made somewhere between the night before and this afternoon, and did not require discussion. Garrett, the youngest, disappeared under the old space heater in the corner, with tools she did not recognize and sounds she could not interpret. 40 minutes later, the unit produced heat for the first time in 15 years, a fact it announced by roaring to life with such enthusiasm that Dorothy stepped back instinctively before she understood what the sound meant. Harmon climbed to the roof. He moved up there with the sureness of someone who had spent significant time at height, assessing and then addressing the sound of his work coming down through the ceiling in steady, deliberate intervals. Patching, sealing, arguing with the November cold about who was going to control the interior. Birch drove away and came back with groceries, set them on the bar without comment. His expression suggested that what he was doing did not require acknowledgement that feeding people was a practical matter and not a transaction. Dane, the one with the chains, who had wanted to push past her the night before, helped her hang curtains. Old ones she found in a closet upstairs, faded floral print that had probably been decorative in a previous decade and was now simply functional. He worked in silence, did not meet her eyes. But when they stepped back and looked at what the curtains did to the room, how they made it feel less like a ruin and more like a place someone had decided to occupy, he nodded once. "Looks better," he said, and returned to his other work. Dorothy cooked that evening, real cooking, the kind she had not done since Miriam had started making comments about the mess. Harold's mother's chili recipe, the one she had made every winter for 30 years with cornbread in a cast iron pan she found in the back of a cabinet that had apparently survived the abandonment in better condition than most things. The men ate like the food was something they had been waiting for without knowing it. Second helpings requested and given. Garrett went back 3 times and did not apologize for it. They sat around the bolted tables in the main room, bowl balanced on the scarred wood, and ate in the comfortable silence of people who had spent the day doing hard work together and had arrived at the other side of it with an appetite. Harmon looked up from his second bowl. His hands were still stained from the roof work. "Mrs. Callahan," he said it with a specificity that meant he had been thinking about how to say it. "This is the best chili I have had in years." Garrett nodded with his mouth full. Dane said nothing but went back for more, which Dorothy understood was the same thing expressed differently. She watched them eat. These men with their leather and their scarred knuckles and their accumulated miles and the reputations that followed them through rooms before they arrived. They looked in this moment in the warm light of a repaired space heater with bowls in their hands like exactly what they were. People who had found something in this building worth coming back to. People who understood in the way that only people who have been without it truly understand the specific value of a place where you were allowed to exist without apology. That night after they had gone, Dorothy walked through the building in the dark with a flashlight. She moved through the main room and the kitchen area and up the stairs and back down. She was learning the shape of what she owned, learning its particular way of holding space, the echoes of her footsteps in the concrete rooms, the way the wind found the gaps in the repaired boards and spoke through them in a low, continuous voice. She stopped at the basement door. The chain was still there, the padlock still held. Whatever was behind it had waited through the whole of the previous day and through Rex's revelations and through dinner and through the work of 5 men making a building livable. It would wait one more night, but not 2. In the morning, Dorothy found the bolt cutters in the supply Birch had brought, heavy steel, the handles worn smooth from use. She carried them to the basement door and stood looking at the padlock and the chain for a long moment. Rex had said they would come. He had not said when. Whatever iron had sealed in this basement 20 years ago, 20 years of being sealed had not diminished its importance to the people who were looking for it. If anything, importance accumulated with time, the way interest accumulated, compounding quietly while no one was watching. She needed to know what she was holding before other people arrived to tell her. She set the bolt cutter jaws against the padlock shackle and applied pressure. The mechanism resisted. Decades of rust and cold had welded the metal into something that did not want to give. She adjusted her grip, put her weight behind it, used the leverage the handles were designed to provide. The padlock broke with a crack that echoed through the empty building. She unwound the chain. It was heavier than it looked, the weight of it pulling at her arms as she let it fall to the floor in a pile that rang against the concrete. She stood for a moment breathing, then reached for the door handle. The door swung inward on hinges that had not moved in 2 decades. The sound they made was not a squeak, but something deeper, a groan that came from the metal itself, from the accumulated protest of all those years of stillness. Darkness waited below, complete, impatient. Dorothy clicked on her flashlight and began to descend. The stairs were solid, old wood dry from decades inside a sealed space. They held her weight without complaint. 7 steps, 8, 9, and then she was standing on the basement floor and sweeping the flashlight beam across a space considerably larger than she had expected. Concrete walls and floor, support beams running the length of the ceiling above her, furniture covered in dust cloths, unidentifiable shapes in the darkness. Cardboard boxes stacked along the near wall, the smell of sealed air, old paper and something faintly chemical that she could not identify. She opened the nearest box. Club records. Meeting minutes going back to the early 1970s, the paper brittle and yellowed but still legible. Financial ledgers, membership rolls with names and dates. She set the box aside and opened the next. More administrative records. The paper trail of 40 years of organized existence. Then she turned toward the far wall. The flashlight beam reached it, and she stopped walking. Photographs. Not like the ones upstairs. Not the celebrations and the processions and the gatherings. These were different. These were children. Dozens of them, maybe more, affixed to the wall in the same overlapping way as the photographs above, covering every available inch of the concrete surface, from approximately chest height to the ceiling. Young faces, teenagers mostly, some younger, all carrying in their expressions that particular quality that Dorothy recognized from 34 years of teaching at Hargrove Elementary, the look of someone who has learned to expect very little from the world and is reserving judgment about whether this moment is different. Each photograph was labeled, dated, in careful handwriting that she recognized from the caption beneath the photograph upstairs. Jamie got home safe, 1974. Crystal 6 months clean, 1989. Marcus back with grandmother, 1982. Danny new start in Pennsylvania, 1983. Sarah found family, 1977. Richie reunited with Aunt, 1979. Dorothy moved the flashlight slowly across the wall. The dates spanned decades. 1972 through 2003. 31 years of photographs. 31 years of names and outcomes recorded in the same careful hand. She was still standing in front of the wall when she noticed the wooden crate. It sat beneath the photographs, pushed against the base of the wall. Old wood, the kind used for shipping things that mattered, reinforced at the corners with metal brackets gone soft with rust. She knelt beside it with difficulty and lifted the lid. A journal sat on top of everything else. Leather-bound, worn at the corners, the cover carrying the specific softness of something that had been handled frequently over many years. She picked it up and opened it with the care you gave things that you understood immediately were fragile. Iron's handwriting filled the first page. Dense and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who chose words carefully and meant every one of them. Every kid we save is another chance the world gave up on. Every life we turn is proof that nobody is beyond the place where rescue is possible. Society calls these children throwaways. We call them family. We call them the reason we are here. Dorothy turned the page. The entries went back to 1972. Each one documented a name, a circumstance, an action taken, an outcome recorded. The language was plain and unsentimental, the language of a man who had no interest in making himself the subject of what he was describing. Found a boy sleeping under the Route 9 overpass. 16 years old. Parents kicked him out. Got him fed, got him warm, called his uncle in Michigan. Uncle is driving down tomorrow morning to get him. Another entry months later. A girl showed up at the back door last night. 14, eye swollen shut, wrist broken wrong. Said her stepfather would kill her if she went back. We believe her. Harmon knows a family in the next county who takes kids in, taking her there in the morning. Page after page, year after year. A hidden record of mercy conducted in silence by men the world had classified as threats. Dorothy sat down on the cold floor of the basement, without deciding to. Her legs simply made the decision. She sat with the journal in her hands and read the flashlight propped against the crate to keep her hands free, the cold working its way up through the concrete and into her bones while she turned pages and read. The scope of it was staggering. Iron had not been running a criminal operation out of this basement. He had been running something closer to what she had spent 34 years doing at Hargrove Elementary, the unglamorous daily work of catching people who were falling and redirecting them towards something better. He had done it in secret because the secret was what kept it safe. A Hells Angels clubhouse that was known to help runaway teenagers was a clubhouse that attracted the wrong attention from the wrong authorities and put the children at risk rather than protecting them. So it stayed hidden for 3 decades. 200 men had passed through this building, and apparently none of them had known what their president was doing in the spaces between everything else. She found the letters at the bottom of the crate, dozens of them sorted by year, held in rubber bands that had dried and cracked. She opened the oldest bundle carefully. The first letter was dated 1991. You probably do not remember me. In 1974, I was 16 years old and I was sleeping under the Route 9 overpass because I had nowhere else to go. You found me. You fed me and let me sleep somewhere warm, and you called my uncle in Michigan, and he came and got me. My uncle raised me. I went to college on a partial scholarship and worked the rest. I am 33 years old now, and I have a family and a home I am proud of and a life I never believed I would have. I have been trying to find a way to thank you for 17 years. I do not have the words, but I wanted you to know that the night you found me under that bridge is the night my life actually started. Jamie Whitmore. Dorothy set the letter down, picked up the next one. They were all variations of the same letter written across different decades by people who had found Iron's address somehow and written to tell him what had happened to the person he had found on a particular night in a particular desperate circumstance. She read until the flashlight began to dim. Then she found the list. It was near the bottom of the crate, folded inside the front cover of the last journal. A single page of names written in Iron's hand labeled simply those who went on. Below the heading, a column of names and dates and brief notations. People who had passed through the clubhouse as frightened teenagers and had become, according to Iron's careful tracking, notable adults. Teachers, doctors, a judge in Ohio, a pastor in Tennessee, a city councilman in Colorado, a sheriff in Montana. Dorothy ran her finger down the column. She stopped. Raymond D., 1983, Pennsylvania, age 15 at time of contact. Sent to maternal grandmother in Lancaster County. Grandmother deceased 1997. Subject lost track of after 2001. Raymond D. She looked at the notation for a long moment. 1983, Pennsylvania, 15 years old. The same year as the letter from Danny, who had described a new start in Pennsylvania. Dorothy was a teacher. She had spent 34 years training her mind to make connections across information, to see patterns in what children said and did not say, to read between the lines of what was presented and find the actual situation underneath. She set the journal down and sat in the cold basement with the flashlight dimming by degrees and thought about what she knew. She had seen Raymond Doyle on television 2 weeks ago. She was certain of it. A news program she had watched at Miriam's, half paying attention, the sound of political commentary that had become the ambient noise of American life. She could see his face in her memory. Mid-50s, careful hair, the practiced ease of someone who had been explaining himself to cameras for a long time. Congressman Raymond Doyle of Pennsylvania, 3 terms in the House, served on the Judiciary Committee, known for his work on public safety legislation and for his aggressive rhetoric about organized crime and motorcycle gangs specifically. She remembered the phrase because it had struck her as particularly emphatic. A cancer on the communities they infect. She remembered thinking the language was extreme. She remembered his origin story because it had been mentioned in the segment. Self-made man, raised by his grandmother in Lancaster County after losing his parents young. Never took a handout, built everything he had through work and determination and the fundamental American belief that where you started did not determine where you ended. Not a word about a Hells Angels clubhouse in November of 1983. Not a word about a frightened 15-year-old who had found shelter with the exact people he now spent his political career describing as a cancer. Dorothy sat on the cold concrete floor of a basement in a building she had bought for $95 and looked at the name Raymond D. written in Iron's careful handwriting and understood. She understood why someone might want these records destroyed. She understood why a man who had built an entire political identity on a specific origin story might be willing to spend significant money to make sure the actual origin story stayed in a sealed basement at the end of a gravel road in a building that nobody was supposed to buy. She understood why the minimum bid had been $95, why the listing had been buried at the bottom of the classified section, why the county had wanted this property off its books with the minimum possible attention drawn to the transaction. Someone had expected this building to stay empty. Someone had miscalculated. Dorothy climbed back up the stairs with the journal under her arm and the list folded in her pocket. She came back up into the main room and stood in the morning light that came through the curtains Dane had helped her hang and looked at the wall of photographs and the names and the leather vests hanging empty by the door. Iron had spent 30 years protecting children no one else wanted to protect. He had recorded everything, carefully keeping the evidence of what he had done against the day it might be needed, and then he had sealed it away and died before he could tell anyone where it was. And someone powerful had spent 20 years hoping it would stay sealed forever. Dorothy walked to the bar and set the journal down and sat on one of the stools and looked at it. She thought about Nadine in the diner, the biscuits placed without ceremony, the bus fare pressed into her hand. The world is not as finished with you as tonight makes it feel. She thought about Rex in the doorway of this room that morning, talking about Iron's philosophy with the specific grief of someone who had loved a person and was only now learning the full dimensions of who that person had been. She thought about a 15-year-old boy in November of 1983 alone and frightened, finding his way to a door that opened. She thought about a congressman who had built a career on calling the people who opened that door a cancer. She picked up the journal and held it with both hands and felt the weight of what was inside it. Outside, a car turned onto the gravel road. Dorothy heard the tires on the loose stone, the particular sound of a vehicle that was not a motorcycle, heavier and more deliberate than that. She went to the window and found the gap in the curtain Dane had hung and looked through it. A black sedan was pulling into the lot. Expensive. The kind of car that communicated money without drawing attention to itself, which was its own form of attention. It stopped. The engine ran for a moment and then cut off. The man who stepped out wore a suit that cost more than Dorothy had made in her first year of teaching. Dark fabric, perfect cut. He stood beside the car and looked at the building with the expression of someone performing an assessment. Then he looked directly at the window she was standing at. Dorothy stepped back from the curtain. Her heart had accelerated in a way it had not since she had stood on Miriam's porch and understood what the dark house meant. But she had stood on that porch too. She had stood there, and she had not collapsed, and she had walked away and found what came next. She went to the door and opened it before he reached it. 3 men now. 2 others had gotten out of the car while she was moving through the room. They stood at intervals in the lot with the deliberate placement of people who had been positioned, not gathered. The man in the suit smiled. The expression was precisely calibrated to communicate reasonableness without warmth. "Mrs. Callahan." His voice matched the suit. Smooth, practiced. The voice of someone who had spent years learning to sound like the most sensible person in any room. "My name is Hargrove. I represent certain interested parties regarding this property." He let a pause sit there. "I am prepared to offer you $50,000. Cash. Today. You sign the deed over and walk away and this is finished." He smiled again. "More than generous for a property in this condition? I think you would agree." Dorothy looked at him. She looked at the 2 men positioned in the lot. She looked at the sedan in its expensive neutrality. "My home is not for sale," she said. Hargrove's smile adjusted. Still present, but recalibrated. "Mrs. Callahan, you paid $95. This is a substantial return on that investment." I said no. Something moved behind his eyes, the reasonableness thinning slightly, showing what was underneath it. "There are items in this building," he said, "that do not technically belong to you. Documents, records, things of a private nature that my clients have a legitimate interest in recovering." Dorothy thought about the journal under her arm, the list in her pocket with Raymond D. written in careful ink. "Everything in this building came with the deed," she said. "It is all legally mine." Hargrove stepped closer. He used the step deliberately, used his height and his youth and the two men positioned behind him the way you use tools to create a geometry of pressure. Legal and wise are different things in practice. He dropped his voice. You are alone here, elderly. This property is isolated. He let the sentence sit unfinished. Dorothy looked at him without adjusting her expression. 34 years of standing in doorways when people wanted her to step back. 34 years of looking at people who expected her to flinch and choosing not to. Get off my property, she said. Hargrove studied her for a moment. Then he smiled one final time, the cold smile of someone who has decided to let the situation develop on its own terms. We will be back, he said, and next time we will not be asking. He turned. The two men followed. The sedan started and backed down the gravel road and disappeared. Dorothy stood in the doorway of her home and listened to the engine fade. Then she went inside, set the journal on the bar, and called Rex. Rex answered on the second ring. Dorothy told him everything. She stood at the bar with the journal in front of her and the list folded in her pocket, and she told him about the basement and the photographs and the 30 years of entries in Iron's careful handwriting and the letters from people who had grown up and found their way back to say thank you. She told him about the list of names and the notation that stopped her cold. Raymond D., 1983, Pennsylvania, 15 years old. She told him about Hargrove and the sitting and the $50,000 and the smile that communicated something other than what it said. Rex was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "We are coming. Do not open the door for anyone until we get there." They arrived in 40 minutes. Not 5 motorcycles this time. Rex and Garrett and Harmon and Birch and Dane, and behind them a truck she had not seen before, driven by a man in his 70s with a white beard and the particular stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that stillness was worth more than noise. They came into the building and she led them to the basement. She watched their faces as they descended the stairs and turned and saw the wall. The silence that followed was of a kind she had not heard before. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people for whom what they are seeing has temporarily made language impossible. Rex stood in front of the photographs for a long time with his jaw tight and his eyes moving slowly across the faces. Garrett picked up one of the letters from the open bundle on the floor, read, "It's standing, set it down with the particular care of someone handling something they have just understood is fragile." Harmon sat on the floor without deciding, to his back against the wall opposite the photographs, and looked at them from that angle, as if the change of perspective might help him process what he was seeing. Dane stood in front of the photograph of Iron with the 15-year-old boy and did not move for a long time. Birch was the first to speak. He never said a word, he said. All those years. Rex turned from the wall. His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the gravel in it. He trusted us with everything else. He told me things he never told another person. Why not this? Dorothy had thought about this in the hours between Hargrove's visit and Rex's arrival. She had thought about it the way she used to think about the decisions her students made, not from the outside, where the reasoning looked obvious, but from the inside, where it made its own sense. Because this was different, she said. Rex looked at her, the children. If anyone had known, if anyone had talked without meaning to, if the wrong person had heard even part of it, the children would have been at risk. Not just the ones here at the time. All of them. Their new names, their new locations, the families they had been sent to. One piece of information in the wrong hands could have unraveled everything Iron spent 30 years building. Rex was quiet. He protected them by keeping it from everyone, she said, including the people he trusted most. Harmon said quietly from his position on the floor, "That sounds like Iron." Rex picked up the list from where Dorothy had left it on the wooden crate. He read it in the dim light of the flashlights they had brought. His expression moved through several phases as he went down the column. Recognition at some names, blankness at others. Then he reached the bottom and stopped. He read it again. Then he looked up at Dorothy. "Raymond Doyle," he said. "Yes." Rex looked back at the list. The congressman. The one who goes on television and calls us a cancer. The one who spent 2 terms pushing legislation specifically targeting motorcycle clubs. His voice was controlled, but carrying something underneath the control that had mass and weight. Iron saved his life, and he built a career on pretending we do not deserve to exist. Dorothy nodded. Rex set the list down carefully. He looked at the wall of photographs. He looked at the letters on the floor. He looked at the journal. Hargrove works for him, Rex said. It was not a question. Dorothy thought about the sedan and the suit and the practiced smile and the way Hargrove had let the sentence sit unfinished about accidents in vulnerable people in isolated places. That is my understanding, she said. Yes. Rex was quiet for a long moment. Around him, the other men waited with the patience of people who understood that some decisions needed the space to form properly. Then he said, you should leave. Go somewhere safe. We can handle this. Dorothy had expected this. She had thought about how to answer it in the hours of waiting, and she had arrived at her answer cleanly and without ambivalence. No, she said. Rex looked at her. I have been pushed out of one home already, she said. Had someone decide for me that I was too much trouble and that disappearing would make everyone's life easier. Her voice was steady. She had not raised it. She did not need to. I will not do that again. This is my home. These records are my responsibility. I am not running. Rex studied her for a long time. The same look he had given her on the first night when she had stepped out of the door into the dark to face 5 motorcycles. The look of someone recalibrating. Then he nodded. The same single deliberate nod he had given her that first night when she told them they could come in but had to knock first. Iron would have liked you, he said. They spent the rest of that day and the next making copies. Dorothy organized the process with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 34 years managing lesson plans and parent records, and the particular administrative demands of a school that never had enough of anything except children who needed help. Every page of Iron's journal was photographed with the camera on the prepaid phone Rex had insisted she keep for emergencies. Every letter was copied. The list of names was photographed 4 times from 4 different angles. Rex contacted his lawyer in Nevada, a man named Stellan, who had handled club matters for 20 years and who listened to Rex's summary without interruption and then said he would have someone at the property within 48 hours. Garrett, who turned out to have skills in this area that he had not previously mentioned, accessed secure digital storage through his laptop and uploaded everything to 3 separate servers in 3 separate locations. If you are asking how I know how to do this, he said to Dorothy, without looking up from the screen, it is better for both of us if you do not ask. Dorothy did not ask. Birch drove to the county seat and rented a safe deposit box and put physical copies of the most important documents inside it. The rental was in Dorothy's name. The key went on a chain around her neck. By the end of the second day, the truth that Iron had sealed in that basement existed in 6 different locations, none of which were the basement, and any one of which could survive the destruction of all the others. If something happens to me, Dorothy told Rex that evening, or to this house, or to any of you, it goes everywhere. Every newspaper in the state, every news station, every person Jennifer Walsh knows, and I have not yet met Jennifer Walsh, but I intend to change that tomorrow. Rex looked at her. Who is Jennifer Walsh? The reporter I am going to call in the morning. Rex was quiet for a moment. Then almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth moved. You have been planning this since before Hargrove left, he said. Since before I called you, Dorothy said. She had found Jennifer Walsh through the local paper, which she had been reading in pieces since Birch brought a week's worth of back issues from town. Walsh was listed as an investigative journalist, her byline appearing on a series about county zoning corruption that had the specific quality of work done by someone who was not going to let a story go, simply because it became inconvenient. Dorothy recognized the quality because she had spent 34 years developing it herself in a different context. She called the number listed in the paper's staff directory the following morning from the prepaid phone. Walsh answered on the 3rd ring with the slightly guarded efficiency of a journalist who had learned to assess unknown callers quickly. Dorothy told her she had a story. She said it was significant. She said it involved a sitting congressman and a 40-year-old secret in a building full of evidence that someone had been trying very hard to keep buried. Walsh was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "When can I come?" She arrived the following afternoon in a 12-year-old sedan that had seen significant mileage and carried in its interior the specific atmosphere of a vehicle that served as a mobile office. Walsh herself was in her early 30s, sharp-eyed with the particular energy of someone who was running on coffee and the specific hunger that came from being very good at something that had not yet fully recognized how good she was. She sat at the bolted table in the main room and listened without interrupting while Dorothy told her everything. When Dorothy finished, Walsh looked at the journal on the table between them and then looked up. She said, if this is what you say it is, and I need to verify everything independently, but if it is, this is not a regional story. I know, Dorothy said. Walsh looked at her with the assessing directness of someone who was trying to understand the full shape of the situation. Why are you doing this? You could have taken the $50,000, walked away from all of it. Dorothy thought about Iron's journal, about the photographs in the basement, about Danny and Jamie and Crystal, and the hundreds of names recorded in Iron's careful handwriting, each one a life that had been falling and had been caught. Because Iron spent 30 years doing this quietly, she said, without recognition, without reward. And the person he saved built his entire career on the lie that people like Iron were the enemy. She paused. That is not right, and someone needs to say so. Not because it will fix everything, but because the truth has a right to exist. Walsh looked at her for a moment longer. Then she opened her notebook. The story required 5 days to verify. Walsh worked with a speed and thoroughness that Dorothy found genuinely impressive, calling sources, cross-referencing arguments, finding the adult children of Iron's rescues through networks that Dorothy would not have known how to access. She found 3 people who were willing to speak on record within the first 2 days. By the 4th day, she had 11. She also found the thing that made the story irrefutable. A woman in her 50s named Helen Marsh, who had been 17 years old in 1979 when she arrived at the back door of 1247 Poplar Ridge Road with nowhere to go. Helen Marsh had become a social worker in the county. She had spent 30 years working with at-risk youth. And she had, over those 30 years, quietly sent a handful of the most desperate cases to the same address Iron had given her when he helped her find her footing, because she had understood that what Iron was doing was real, and she had become part of the informal network without ever fully acknowledging it to herself. Helen Marsh knew the names of 7 others who had gone through the clubhouse. She could corroborate the documentation. She could speak to the practice, the methodology, the specific way Iron operated. She wept when Walsh called her. Not from grief, from something more complicated. The particular emotion of someone who has been carrying a secret for a longer time and has suddenly been given permission to set it down. On the 7th night, Hargrove came back. Dorothy had convinced Rex to let the others take a night off. They had been running the watch schedule for 6 days without meaningful rest. She could see it in them, the specific depletion of people who have been operating on alertness and will rather than actual recovery. Just one night she had said, "The locks are solid. I have the phone. I will call the moment anything happens." Rex had resisted. Eventually, because Dorothy had a specific and well-developed ability to win arguments through patience rather than volume, he had agreed. She locked the doors at 9 and made herself dinner, and sat at the bar reading Iron's journal for the 4th time, finding new things in it that she had missed on the earlier readings, the way you always found new things in documents you returned to. At 11:30, she heard the cars, not motorcycles. The sound was wrong, too smooth, the engines too quiet, the approach too deliberate. She went to the window gap in the curtain. 3 vehicles, maybe 4. Headlights moving down the gravel road with a steadiness that had nothing casual in it. Her hands were steady when she picked up the phone. They had surprised her that way consistently over the past week, her hands. She had expected them to shake more than they did. She called Rex. He answered before the second ring completed. "They are here," she said. "Multiple vehicles. I do not know how many people. We are coming." His voice was already moving, already in the process of getting somewhere. "Do not open the door." 20 minutes. Dorothy looked at the cars pulling into the lot. Doors opening. She counted 8 men before she stopped counting and accepted that the number was sufficient to mean something. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before, not chaotic but organized, taking positions around the building with the practiced geometry of people who had been told exactly what to do and in what order. Hargrove stepped out of the lead vehicle. His suit was as precise as it had been the first time. His expression had shed the performance of reasonableness entirely. He looked at the building the way a person looked at a problem they had decided to resolve. "Mrs. Callahan," his voice carried across the lot without needing to be raised. "Last chance. Open the door. Give us what we came for, and this ends tonight with no further complications." Dorothy stood at the window for a moment longer. 20 minutes was too long. She understood this with a practical clarity that had no room for panic. Rex was 20 minutes away, and Hargrove was 30 feet from her door, and 8 men were positioned around a building that they had not yet entered only because they had not yet decided to make the entry forcible. She thought about what she had in the room with her. The truth, copies of everything already in 6 locations. The specific knowledge of exactly what Raymond Doyle had done and what he was trying to make disappear. And 34 years of experience standing in difficult situations without flinching. Dorothy Callahan opened the door and stepped outside. The cold hit her immediately. November air, the deepest cold of the night, the kind that came just before dawn when the temperature found its lowest point. She walked across the porch and down the 2 steps into the gravel lot and stopped 10 feet from Hargrove. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating the situation he had not expected to take this shape. She spoke before he could. "I found the list," she said. "I found the journal. I found the letters from every person Iron helped over 30 years. She reached into her pocket and produced the folded copy she had been carrying since the first day. "I know who Raymond D. is. I know what a 15-year-old boy named Raymond Doyle found at this address in November of 1983. And I know what the man he became has spent 3 terms in Congress telling the world about people like Iron." She looked at Hargrove steadily. "And I have sent copies to 6 different locations." She let that sit for a moment. "If anything happens to me tonight, to this house, to any of the men who have been helping me, everything goes public. Every newspaper in the state, every news station that would be interested in the story of a congressman who owes his life to the people he built his career destroying." Hargrove's face had gone through several phases during this. The practiced blankness of a professional. Then something underneath the blankness beginning to surface. He opened his mouth. "You are bluffing," he said. "Try me," Dorothy said. The standoff had a particular quality. The cold and the dark, and the 8 men positioned around the building, and Hargrove 3 feet away from her with whatever calculation was running behind his eyes. Dorothy stood in the center of it and breathed and did not look away from his face. Then she heard the engines. Distant first, then building. The unmistakable sound of motorcycles at road speed. Not 1 or 2, but many. The accumulated thunder of machines arriving with the specific urgency of people who have somewhere to be immediately. Headlights appeared on the road. 1 pair, then another, then more. Rex came in first, bringing his motorcycle to a stop in the gravel with the controlled precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Behind him, Garrett and Harmon and Birch and Dane. And behind them, 5 more motorcycles she did not recognize. Then 3 more. Then 2 more after that. 12 machines lined up across the width of the lot, their engines rumbling at idle, their headlights creating a wall of light between Hargrove's men and Dorothy's door. 12 men dismounted with the deliberate, unhurried movement of people who have calculated the situation and have not found anything in it that requires them to hurry. Rex walked forward until he stood beside Dorothy. He did not say anything to Hargrove. He looked at the 8 men positioned around the building and let the silence communicate what needed communicating. Then from the road, another set of headlights appeared, different from the motorcycles. Lower the movement of a vehicle on 4 wheels. It turned into the lot, and Dorothy saw the shape of it and understood, and the tight thing in her chest loosened by a single degree. A car. Sheriff's Department markings. The door opened and Sheriff Dunbar stepped out, broad and gray-templed, wearing the particular expression of a man who had broken up too many situations to be surprised by this one, but was still going to take it seriously. He was not alone. From the passenger side, a woman in her 50s climbed out, moving with the purpose of someone who had decided on the way here that she was not going to stand at a comfortable distance. Nadine, she crossed the lot without hesitation and stood beside Dorothy. "Thought you might need some witnesses," she said. "Been keeping an eye on things since that first night." Sheriff Dunbar surveyed the scene. His gaze moved from Dorothy to Rex to Hargrove, to the 8 men at their positions, and back to Hargrove. He said, "Everyone stand down. Nobody moves until I understand what I am looking at." Hargrove began to speak. Dorothy watched him reach for the practiced reasonableness, try to reassemble the professional surface that the past 10 minutes had partially dismantled. Dunbar cut him off. "I have had 5 separate complaints about activity around this property in the past week," he said. "Intimidation, harassment, threats against the resident." He looked at Dorothy. "You want to press charges tonight?" Dorothy looked at Hargrove, at the 8 men who had come here to take from her what she had found, at Rex and the 12 motorcycles lined up across the lot, and Nadine standing beside her with the solid, practical presence of someone who showed up because showing up was what the moment required. "Not tonight," she said, "but I want it documented. Every face, every license plate, every threat that has been made against me and this property since I took possession." Dunbar nodded. He moved toward Hargrove's men with the authority of 30 years and a badge, and one by one they retreated to their vehicles under his attention and the collective scrutiny of 12 bikers who had decided that watching carefully was the most useful contribution they could make. Hargrove was last. He lingered after the others had gotten into their cars. He looked at Dorothy with an expression that had finally shed all its professional layers and showed what was underneath. Not rage, something more complicated than rage. The specific expression of a man who has run out of moves in a situation he had been certain he controlled. "This is not over," he said quietly. Dorothy looked at him. "I know," she said, "but it is going to end differently than you planned, because I am not who you thought I was, and these men are not what you told yourself they were." Hargrove held her gaze for a moment. Then he walked to a sedan and got in, and the engine started, and the car backed down the gravel road, and the red taillights moved away until the dark took them. Dorothy stood in the cold and watched them go. Then Rex was beside her, not saying anything, just standing there in the way that people stand when they have understood that the moment does not require words, and after a while Dorothy said, "Thank you for coming back fast." And Rex said, "We did not all drive away. 3 of us stayed on the road, just in case." And Dorothy understood then that she had not been as alone as the night had made her feel. Sheriff Dunbar stayed until the sky began its slow shift toward gray. His name was Edmund Dunbar, and he had been wearing a badge in this county for 29 years, and he sat at the bolted table with coffee Dorothy made on the repaired stove and listened to everything she told him about the basement and the journal and the list and Hargrove and what Hargrove represented. He read the relevant sections of the journal without rushing. He looked at the copy of the list for a long time. Then he said, "Mrs. Callahan, I need you to understand what you are dealing with." Dorothy waited. The man Hargrove represents, Dunbar said, has resources and connections that extend well beyond what you have seen so far. He can make problems appear from directions you are not watching. Building code violations, tax issues, zoning questions that did not exist last month. He can make your life difficult in ways that are technically legal and practically exhausting. "I understand," Dorothy said. Dunbar looked at her. "Do you? Because what I am saying is that filing reports and documenting incidents is what I can do. It is not everything you are going to need." Dorothy looked at the journal on the table. Then she looked at Dunbar. "Then I had better make sure the story exists somewhere that cannot be made to disappear by a building inspector," she said. Dunbar was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The press." Dorothy said, "I have a reporter. She has been working for 5 days. She has 11 people willing to go on record. She has documentation she has verified independently." Dunbar looked at her with the specific expression of a man reassessing a situation he had thought he understood. Then he said, "How long until she runs it?" 2 days, Dorothy said. "If I tell her to go." Dunbar picked up his coffee. He drank it and looked at the wall of photographs and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You should tell her to go." The story ran on a Thursday morning. Jennifer Walsh had worked with a speed that Dorothy found extraordinary understanding. Perhaps that the window for this story was determined not by editorial calendars, but by how long it took Hargrove's clients to find another approach. The headline ran across the front page of the regional paper with a photograph of Iron from the basement wall, gray-bearded and clear-eyed, looking at something outside the frame. Motorcycle Club president secretly saved hundreds of runaway children for 30 years. Below it, in smaller type documents, reveal Congressman's hidden connection to the man he built, career attacking. By noon, the story had been picked up by the state wire service. By 3 in the afternoon, 2 national outlets had called Walsh for permission to republish. By the following morning, it was on the morning programs, the cable networks, the websites that reached millions of people who would never read a regional newspaper. The detail that no one could ignore. Congressman Raymond Doyle of Pennsylvania, the self-made success story, the 3-term incumbent, the man who had made opposition to motorcycle gangs a centerpiece of his public identity, had been a frightened 15-year-old runaway in November of 1983. Had been found, had been fed, and given shelter and connected with his maternal grandmother in Lancaster County, had been saved by the exact people he had spent his career telling America were beyond redemption. His grandmother had raised him. His official biography said she had taken him in after his parents died in an accident. No accident. His parents had been alive. He had left. There was a difference between those two stories, and it was the difference between a bootstrap myth and the truth. Doyle's office released a statement within hours. A fabrication, manufactured documents, a coordinated attack by criminal elements seeking to undermine legitimate public safety work. Then Helen Marsh went on camera. She was calm and specific and entirely credible. She described her own experience in 1979. She described the informal network she had become part of. She named 3 others who had already spoken to Walsh and confirmed they were willing to be named publicly. She looked at the camera with the particular authority of someone who has been carrying the truth for a longer time and has finally found the right moment to set it down. The letters came next. People who had seen the story and recognized something in it. Adults who had been teenagers in desperate circumstances and had found their way to a door at the end of a gravel road and found it open. They called the newspaper and they called the television stations and they posted on the internet in the way that stories spread, now one account generating another, each confirmation making the denial less possible. A man flew in from Oregon. He arrived at Dorothy's door on the 4th day after the story broke, stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, eyes carrying the particular emotion of someone who has something large to deliver and is not sure his voice is going to cooperate. He said his name was Thomas Briley, said he had been 16 years old and addicted to things he was not proud of, and living in places that were not fit for living in when someone had pointed him toward Copper Ridge Road in the winter of 1981. Said iron had given him a room and food and 3 weeks to get his feet under him, and had then found his older sister in Ohio and put him on a bus. He held up his phone and showed her a photograph, a family. Children, grandchildren, a woman beside him who was clearly the axis around which the rest of them organized themselves. "This is my life," he said, and I never got to thank him. Dorothy put her hand on his arm and told him that Iron had known. That the journal said he had known that Iron had tracked what happened to the people he helped for as long as he was able, and the last entry about Thomas Briley said only Thomas doing well in Ohio. Good kid. Always knew he would find his way. Thomas Briley stood on the porch of the building that had once been his temporary salvation and wept without embarrassment the way men wept when they had stopped pretending that not weeping was a form of strength. Raymond Doyle held a press conference on the 11th day. He looked smaller than his television appearances had made him look. The careful construction of his public persona had developed hairline cracks, and, in person under the lights, those cracks were visible in a way that cameras and distance had previously concealed. He stood at the podium and said the words that his advisors had presumably told him were the only remaining option. Yes, he had been a runaway. Yes, the clubhouse had helped him. Yes, his account of losing his parents had been a fabrication constructed early in his political career when he had been ashamed of the truth and had not yet understood that shame was a poor foundation for a public identity. He was sorry. His donors had already begun their quiet withdrawal before the press conference. His colleagues had begun their practice distancing. By the time he resigned the following morning, the infrastructure of his political existence had already understood that the calculation no longer worked, that association with the boss who had built a career on a lie was a liability that outweighed whatever continued association might offer. He resigned at 9 in the morning in a statement read by a spokesperson because he could not apparently find a way to say it himself. Hargrove's consequences came slower but were thorough. Sheriff Dunbar's documentation of the intimidation and threats became the foundation for a bar association inquiry. Other people came forward, people who had been on the receiving end of Hargrove's specific methods on behalf of clients who needed things made to disappear quietly. People who had been too afraid to speak until they saw that someone else had spoken first and survived. His license was suspended pending review in January. The review concluded in April. The license was not reinstated. Dorothy announced the foundation on a cold Saturday in December. Rex had brought the motorcycles. Walsh had come with a small crew. Helen Marsh drove 3 hours to be there. Dunbar stood near the back in civilian clothes, off-duty present, because he had decided that being present was the right thing to do. Nadine brought food because Nadine's response to significant occasions was always to bring food, and the table she set along the bar held enough for twice the number of people in the room. Dorothy stood at the front of the gathered group and felt the particular quality of the moment, the specific weight of standing in a place that had accumulated enough history to give the air itself a texture. This building saved children for 30 years, she said. Iron built something here that the world did not see and did not know to look for. 200 men passed through these walls and found somewhere they were allowed to be broken while they figured out how to be whole. She paused. I want to do that again, but for a different kind of person who has been told they are no longer worth the trouble. She turned to the wall behind her, where a sign had been mounted above the fireplace beneath Iron's carved words about shelter from the storm. Iron's Gate, a refuge for seniors facing homelessness. The room was quiet. Below the name in smaller letters, words she had chosen carefully, where no one rides alone. This building will be a home, she said, for people like me. People who have been told by the world that their usefulness has expired. People whose families have closed their doors. People whose resources have run out and who have nowhere left to go. She looked at the bikers. Iron believed that nobody gets left behind. This foundation will carry that forward, because children are not the only ones the world throws away. Rex stepped forward. His voice was rougher than usual. The club pledges what we can, maintenance, security, whatever physical work needs doing. We will be here. The $40,000 Iron had left became the beginning. Donations came from people who had read the story and been moved by it, from former rescues of Iron who had built successful lives and wanted to give something back, from unexpected corners of a community that had spent 15 years pretending the building at the end of Copper Ridge Road did not exist and was now reconsidering what it represented. By the end of December, the foundation had enough to begin operations. The first resident arrived on a Thursday in January. His name was Garrett Bowman, 79 years old. He had served 2 tours in a conflict that had marked him in ways he did not discuss, and had come home to a life he had built carefully and well, a life that had included a wife and a career and a house with a yard and the ordinary satisfactions of someone who had earned what he had. Then the wife had died. Then the children had moved to places where the distance was not purely geographical. Then the pension that had seemed sufficient had encountered a landlord who understood that sufficiency was relative. He arrived on a January Thursday with a single duffel bag. He stood on the porch and looked at the building with the expression of someone who has been in enough situations to have learned not to judge them too quickly. Heard you might have room for someone like me, he said. His voice was quiet and carried no performance of need in it, just a direct statement of a situation. Dorothy smiled. There is always room, she said. Come in. She led him through the main room. Garrett looked at the walls as he passed, at the names and the photographs and the leather vests hanging from their hooks. He looked at the bar and the stage and the fireplace with Iron's carved words above it. Hell's Angels Clubhouse, he said. Did not expect to end up somewhere like this. Life takes you places you did not plan for, Dorothy said. In my experience, that is mostly how the interesting ones happen. She showed him the room upstairs that Rex and the others had renovated, small but warm, a window looking out over the empty land to the east where the sky was large and the light in the early morning that had a quality that she had come to think of as the building's particular gift. The way the sunrise came in from that direction and filled the upper rooms with something that was not quite gold, but was adjacent to it. Garrett set his duffel bag on the floor and stood in the room for a moment. Thank you, he said. His voice cracked at the edge of the word, in the way voices cracked when the emotion they were carrying was larger than the word it was attached to. Nobody else had a place for me. Dorothy put her hand on his arm. You are home now, she said. Miriam's letter arrived on a Tuesday. Dorothy recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she registered the return address. She had spent enough hours watching that handwriting produce grocery lists and birthday cards and the occasional note left on the kitchen counter to know it immediately. She opened it at the bar in the main room with the afternoon light coming through the curtains. Mom, I know I do not deserve your time. What I did was not something I can explain in a way that makes it reasonable, because it was not reasonable. It was cruel and it was cowardly, and I have been sitting with that understanding for months. I watched what you did. I saw you on television, and I read the story about the building and the foundation, and I saw the woman you are, the woman you always were. I was just too absorbed in my own failures to recognize it when you were standing in front of me. I am sorry. Not because I expect forgiveness. I am sorry because I need you to know that I see you now. If you ever want to talk, the number is below. Dorothy read the letter twice. Then she sat with it for a long time in the quiet of the afternoon, the building settling around her in its particular language of old wood and cold air, and the distant sound of someone working in the garage that Rex had converted into a workshop. She thought about Iron's journal, about the entries that documented not just the children he had helped, but the philosophy underneath, the helping the belief that the capacity for redemption was not the exclusive property of any category of person, that the line between the lost and the found was not a fixed boundary, but a permeable one that people crossed in both directions throughout their lives. She thought about what it meant to forgive, not the greeting card version, the actual thing. The decision to acknowledge what happened clearly without softening it, and then to choose connection over the easier choice of permanent distance. She picked up the phone. It rang twice. Mom. Miriam's voice was small in a way Dorothy had not heard since Miriam was very young, since the years before the distance had developed between them, before the complicated machinery of adult relationship had replaced the simpler thing that had existed before. Hello, sweetheart, Dorothy said. The silence on the line lasted long enough that Dorothy wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Miriam began to cry. Not the practiced cry of someone performing emotion, but the real kind, the kind that arrived without warning and took over before it could be controlled or managed. I am so sorry, Miriam said. I do not know how to. I do not. I know, Dorothy said. Can you? Is there any? Her voice broke and reformed and broke again. Can you forgive me? Dorothy looked out the window at the gravel lot where motorcycles gathered every November. At the workshop where Garrett Bowman was learning at 79 years old to restore a carburetor under the instruction of a 63-year-old man with braided gray hair who had decided that teaching was the most useful thing he had to offer. At the garden that would go in behind the building in the spring, planned already on paper, the beds marked out with stakes and string by 3 residents who had argued cheerfully for 2 weeks about which vegetables deserved the premium spots. I can try, she said. That is what I can honestly offer you. I can try, that is enough, Miriam said. That is more than I deserve. They talked for an hour, not the difficult talk, not the accounting of damage and grievance that would come later when they were both ready for it. Just the preliminary talk, the careful reestablishment of the basic fact of connection, the recognition that the line was still open. When Miriam said she wanted to visit, Dorothy said yes. When Miriam said she wanted to help, Dorothy said there was always work to be done. When Miriam said she was sorry one more time, as the conversation ended, Dorothy said, I know. And then because it was true, and because the truth mattered more than the comfortable approximation of the truth, I am working on it. The anniversary came in November, 1 year since Dorothy had stood on Miriam's porch with $95 and nowhere to go. Motorcycles filled the gravel lot before noon. Not 5 this time, not 12. Dozens. Men who had ridden with Iron decades ago, and men who had only heard the stories, men from chapters in states Dorothy had never visited, men who had read the story Walsh had written and understood something in it that they needed to be physically present to honor. Iron's Gate had 16 residents by that morning. Men and women who had come through various passages of loss and circumstance to find themselves at the end of a gravel road in November, knocking on a door that opened. The residents moved among the bikers with the ease of people who had stopped being surprised by the particular community they had found themselves part of. Miriam had been there for 3 months by then, not as a resident, as a volunteer who stayed in the small room off the kitchen that had once been a storage space and was now adequate and warm. She cooked on weekday evenings and helped with the paperwork that a foundation generated in quantities that Dorothy found both necessary and relentless. She was learning in the particular way that learning happened when it was driven by genuine need rather than external requirement, what it meant to show up. She and Dorothy were not what they had been before. They were not what they had been in the 2 years on Sycamore Street either. They were something that was still being built carefully and without the assumption of any particular outcome, the kind of relationship that required daily maintenance and could not be taken for granted. That was fine. Dorothy had found that most things worth having required daily maintenance. Rex was the last to leave when the afternoon began to give way to evening. He stood with Dorothy on the porch while the other motorcycles departed one by one, engines starting and fading, the lot emptying back toward its ordinary quiet. He would be proud, Rex said. Iron. He would be proud of what you built here. Dorothy looked at the building behind her. The repaired roof and the curtains in the windows and the warm light coming from inside where someone was playing the piano that had arrived as a donation in September, and where the smell of Miriam's cooking was finding its way out through the gaps in the old door frames. I did not build it alone, she said. Rex was quiet for a moment. No. But you started it. You opened the door when anyone else would have walked away. Dorothy thought about that first night, the dark building and the cold and the painted skull on the garage door, the sound of 5 motorcycles arriving at 2 in the morning, the choice between the corner of the room and the door. Sometimes opening the door is enough, she said. Rex nodded. He mounted his motorcycle. The engine came to life with the sound she had come to associate not with threat, but with arrival, with the specific reassurance of people who showed up when showing up was what the moment required. Same time next year, he said. Same time every year, Dorothy said. He rode away into the early dark. She watched until his taillight disappeared around the bend in the gravel road. Then she turned and went back inside. The main room was warm. Garrett Bowman sat across a chessboard from a woman named Frances, who had arrived 6 weeks ago, and who had, it turned out, been a competitive chess player in her 40s, and who was currently engaged in the patient project of teaching Garrett everything she knew, which was considerable. 2 residents she did not immediately spot were the source of the piano music, something slow and familiar that she could not name, but that she associated with a particular era of American life, the kind of music that carried memory in it, whether you intended it to or not. Miriam was setting the table for dinner. She looked up when Dorothy came in, and their eyes met across the room in the way that eyes met when 2 people were still in the process of learning how to look at each other again, without the weight of everything that had happened between them, making the looking difficult. Dorothy nodded, Miriam nodded back. Small things, but small things were how the real ones were built. She walked through the room toward the kitchen, past the walls where Iron's names still covered the wood from floor to ceiling, 40 years of men who had found something here worth putting their names on. Past the fireplace with its carved words about shelter from the storm. Past the bar where Iron had died alone on a November night 21 years ago working on something that mattered. He had not known she was coming. He had not known that a woman would arrive one day with $95 and a locked door behind her and enough iron in her spine to open his. He had built the door anyway. Dorothy passed through the kitchen and out the back door and stood for a moment in the cold November air, looking at the land behind the building where the garden beds were staked out for spring. The sky had gone dark in that particular way. It went dark in November quickly and completely, stars appearing as the light failed, more of them than you expected when the clouds cleared. She stood there for a while, long enough to feel the cold properly, long enough to be in the moment rather than passing through it. Then she went back inside. Someone was already knocking at the front door. She could hear it from the kitchen. 3 careful raps on the metal. The knock of someone who had been told that knocking was what you did here, that this was a place where the door answered. She walked through the main room, past the chess game and the piano and the table Miriam was setting. She reached the door and opened it. A man stood on the porch, 82 years old perhaps, thin frame carrying a dignity that circumstances had not managed to fully strip. A worn suitcase at his feet, the kind that had traveled extensively, and showed it. Behind him, the gravel lot was empty, a taxi already gone, its sound fading down the road toward town. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has run out of options and is not sure what the face of the last one looks like. Heard there might be room here, he said, for someone like me. Dorothy looked at him, at the suitcase and the cold and the taxi, already gone, and the careful dignity of a man who had not yet decided whether he was allowed to need what he needed. She stepped back from the doorway. There is always room, she said. Come in. He picked up his suitcase. He stepped across the threshold. The door closed behind him. Inside, the piano played on. The chess game continued. Miriam moved around the table, setting places for dinner, one more than she had said a minute ago because she had heard the knock and had already understood what it meant. The fire in the old fireplace threw its light across the names on the walls. 40 years of men who had found shelter here. And above the fireplace in the letters, Aaron had carved himself. And the first week he had this building, in the first week he had understood what he was trying to build and why. For those who ride into the storm, may they find shelter here. Outside, the November dark lay over everything, over the gravel lot in the garage, and the painted skull that still proclaimed something to a world that had tried to forget this place existed. Over the garden beds staked out for spring, over the road that wound back toward town, and the world beyond it, the world that threw people away when it decided they were finished. Inside, the light held.